Hi, I'm Dan Welch with Emerging Civil War, and with me is Kevin Pawlak of Emerging Civil War as well. And we are in the Antietam National Battlefield's National Cemetery to talk a little bit about the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam and why we still refer to Civil War battlefields as hallowed ground. At the end of the fighting of September 17, 1862, 23,000 Union and Confederate soldiers had become casualties of the battle, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Antietam remains in 2019 as America's single bloodiest day. And for the weeks and months following the battle, the cleanup effort and care of the wounded would continue. Many of those that had been wounded in combat throughout the fighting of September 17th would later succumb to those wounds. And those that had been killed outright on the field would all receive temporary burials across this landscape. Burials would dot the farm fields around Sharpsburg, Maryland for years, and hospital cemeteries would spring up at the many buildings used in and around the town of Sharpsburg. Nearly a decade after the American Civil War's bloodiest day at Antietam had come to an end, Antietam National Cemetery's construction would begin and later be dedicated. They would remove killed men from the battlefield and bring them here for a final, fitting, and proper place. But not all of those reinterments from the Antietam battlefield to the National Cemetery occurred in the later half of the 19th century. We refer to these battlefields as hallowed ground because many of the dead had not been removed, and some still lie on these fields at places like Antietam, Gettysburg, Fredericksburg, the Wilderness, and so many other battlefields of the American Civil War. Joining us today, Kevin Pawlak will tell us a little bit more about the reasons why we still refer to it as hallowed ground, as Union soldiers' remains were recovered from the battlefield in the late 1980s.
Thank you, Dan. So as Dan was mentioning, and as we have found here at Antietam and at many other places, the aftermath of these battles has never really come to an end. In 1988, the partial remains of 4 humans were found in the area of the observation tower before that ground was owned by the National Park Service. And archaeological studies were conducted, and based off the findings, it was determined that those 4 remains were soldiers that were killed in action at the Battle of Antietam. There were New York buttons that were found around those remains as well, and also bits of religious symbols and religious items such as rosaries. And so it was determined that those 4 soldiers were just 4 of the killed of the 540 casualties that the Irish Brigade suffered in their assaults on the Bloody Lane on September 17th of 1862. So in 1989, those 4 partial remains were removed here to the National Cemetery, and they rest underneath this stone that Dan and I are standing in front of. Back most recently in 2008, in an area north of the cornfield, more human remains were found. It was determined that the remains were, again, that of a soldier from the state of New York. Based off his bone structure, he was probably 17 to 19 years old when he perished here on September 17th. But New York buttons were found, and so the soldiers' remains were disinterred from the battlefield and moved to Saratoga National Cemetery, where they still rest in an unknown grave today, like many of the graves here in Antietam National Cemetery that are still unknown. So as you come to these places, as Dan mentioned, please do think of them as hallowed ground. The dead do not just rest on the grounds here in the cemeteries, but rest under the very places where you are walking as you make your way around these hallowed places and these battlefields.
Absolutely right, Kevin. One of the things we must always keep in mind that these men gave what Lincoln would call their last full measure of devotion. And whether you're exploring the national cemeteries of these battlefields or walking the battlegrounds themselves, we must always remember the more than 750,000 men that gave their lives during the American Civil War and the more than 3 million that served during that same period. With Emerging Civil War, I'm Dan Welch.
Kevin Pawlak.
And we'll see you next time here on ECW's YouTube channel.